So last time I taught, we discussed Thomas Münster, who actually led troops in the German peasants' revolt that Luther condemned. Well, today we're going to talk about Melchior Hoffman, who didn't lead any troops, but was actually the inspiration behind the rebellion in Münster, where radical Anabaptists, which today that's kind of a contradiction in terms, but radical Anabaptists took over the city of Münster, and while he was not part of it, he was the inspiration for it. So it's a little confusing. Like I said last time, Thomas Münster was not the guy who took over Münster. Melchior Hoffman was the guy who was involved in that. So Melchior Hoffman is kind of a lay preacher, traveling itinerant preacher who actually spent as much of his adult life in jail. So he's born around 1495 in Schwabisch Hall in Franconia, which I think is kind of cool. 1521 or 22, he's exposed to Protestant reformers in Livonia, which is modern-day Latvia and Estonia. And if you think that Vladimir Putin doesn't have his eye on Latvia and Estonia, you haven't been paying attention. That's just an aside note there. 1523, he becomes a lay preacher in Volmer, Dorpat, and Revel. 1524, lay preacher in Dorpat. He speaks out against all use of imagery in churches. So in this sense, he would be similar to Zwingli or Karlstadt. June 1525, he meets with Luther in Wittenberg and receives Luther's written recommendation. This will not last long. By the way, my voice is a bit like yours was several weeks ago. The reason I didn't shake anybody's hand this morning is because I have a cough. It's caused by the allergies, but just to be sure I'm not touching anyone today. Fall 1525, preaching in Revel, Estonia, and is accused of heresy by the Lutheran preachers there. So you can see his recommendation from Luther lasted a full 2 or 3 months. 1526, he arrives in Stockholm, Sweden, where he is eventually asked to leave on January 13th, 1527. He writes a commentary on the book of Daniel in his spare time. 1527, works as a preacher in Kiel, Denmark, but also works as a printer, which is a handy trade to have at that time, just like being a webmaster is probably a handy thing to know how to do today if you're trying to spread a certain religious point of view. April 8, 1529, a colloquy of preachers in Flensburg, Schleswig-Holstein. Hoffman takes the Zwinglian view of the Antichrist, and of course it's immediately banished by Lutheran preachers. So now we have some Lutheran influence on him, but we also have some Zwinglian influence on him. So what was he? May 1529, accompanied by none other than Andreas Karlstadt, Hoffman goes to East Frisia in Lower Saxony. Karlstadt is the person who conferred Luther's doctrine on him, and later the two would not be in speaking terms. June 1529, he travels to Strasbourg. I mentioned that simply because during at least the early part of the Reformation, Strasbourg is kind of a melting pot of different Protestant ideas. Martin Bucer is there and others. 1530, he publishes 2 books that would later be used by Noah Simons: Prophecy from the Holy and Divine Scripture, and Prophecy from the True, Holy, and Divine Scripture. So sometimes when people try to push off his Anabaptist connections, here are 2 works that he were actually used by kind of the head and the Hoff of the Anabaptists and Menno Simons. April 1530, he demands before the Council of Strasbourg that Anabaptists receive equal treatment to other churches. He becomes an Anabaptist and is rebaptized. So now he's officially a card-carrying Anabaptist, which still have a response to it. April 23rd, 1530, leaves Strasbourg, and the council moves against him for his open support of the Anabaptists. So he does a lot of traveling, and he gets thrown out of all the best towns. He travels to East Frisia, Lower Saxony. Luther warns the authorities that Hoffman is committed to Satan.
Oh my. So much for that endorsement letter.
Yeah, so much for the recommendation letter.
There should be a different recommendation.
Yeah.
And I love that. He has a different view on the Eucharist, so he's committed to Satan. June 1530, he founds an Anabaptist community at Emden in Lower Saxony and baptizes 300 people. The community still existed as late as 1957. Summer 1530, he returns to Strasbourg over concern for his wife and child. Remember, he had gotten kicked out of there a short time before. 1531, travels to Amsterdam, Holland, baptizes 50 people, and then comes back to Strasbourg. December 5th, 1531, several of his followers, called Melchior Hoffman, are beheaded in The Hague, Netherlands. And I'm assuming this is just a precursor to the European Union's meeting in The Hague. 1533 publishes his commentary on Romans from Strasbourg. And May 1533, City Council of Strasbourg arrests Hoffman for fomenting dissent and for preaching that the kingdom of Christ would occur first in Strasbourg. And he makes the mistake that all millennialists make. He actually gives a date when Christ is going to return. Now, you have all probably figured out that Christ did not return in July of 1533, and he did lose some credibility as a result. They call a synod in Strasbourg to question Melchior Hoffman about his faith. And since Luther had gone through the same thing, you would have thought maybe that Luther might have had a little sympathy for the guy. Needless to say, he had none. February 1534 to June 1535, so it lasts over a year, Anabaptists take over Munster, Westphalia. Some of them are followers of Hoffman. So as a result, the whole thing is blamed on Melchior Hoffman, even though he is actually sitting in jail at the time in Strasbourg and had nothing whatsoever to do with the takeover of Munster. As part of the festivities in Westphalia, polygamy is introduced as well as a form of communal ownership of property. May 4th, 1534, feeling he's not suffering enough, Hoffman requests that he be put into a dungeon instead of the jail facility that he's being held in. And they agree, so they put him in a dungeon. June 24th, 1535, Munster falls to Catholic forces. Again, Hoffman is still in jail. Spring 1535, he now states that Christ will return in 1535 instead of 1533, and that Strasbourg should use Anabaptists to protect the city from revolting peasants. At this point, I think people in Strasbourg are starting to think that he's maybe a little... January 1536, the conspirators in the Munster Rebellion are executed in the Munster Town Square. A certain dramatic touch to that, I think. June 1539, one of the great, most prominent of the reformers, Martin Bousset, meets with Hoffman in his prison cell, and in 1543 he dies in prison in Strasbourg. So you will see he actually had nothing whatsoever to do with the Munster Revolt, but his name has been eternally associated with it. This is the only known drawing of Melchior Hoffman. I don't know why artists over the ages haven't done many portraits of Melchior Hoffman. But there he is. He's got the hat on, the Johnny angle.
Well, it's very dapper looking back over your shoulder, too. Very GQ for the time.
He's actually a furrier by trade. He's not really a preacher. He's not trained to be a preacher. And as often happens when people aren't trained to be preachers, but they become preachers, they tend to be very focused on apocalyptic preacher. Preaches in Sweden, Holland, Denmark, Germany, and Strasbourg, which I'm never sure is part of France or Germany, so that's why I always list it separately. Depending on what day it is, it's part of one or the other. He did not have a typical theological education that most of the other reformers did, hence his ideas tend to be original. He's influenced by Luther. Actually meets him in Wittenberg in 1525, but since he eventually moves to Zwingli's view of the Eucharist and is influenced by both Karlstadt and Schwenkfelder, he is disowned by Martin Luther. By 1530, Hoffman had become an Anabaptist. He had an anti-clerical message, which was popular with the common folk, which is why he lasted as long as he did, because remember we saw he'd go to a town and baptize 50 people, 300 people, whatever. Well, the common people like the anti-clerical message. He's sometimes referred to as the father of Dutch Anabaptism. You won't hear the official hierarchy of Anabaptism referring to him as that, but he's sometimes referred to that way. Strong apocalyptic millennialist flavor to his preaching. Today we call him a millennialist. Predicted the imminent return of Christ in multiple years. It did not occur, so he lost some credibility. Spent the last 10 years of his life in a prison cell in Strasbourg, where he had been arrested for fomenting dissent. And they had offered various deals to him over this time. That, you know, if you say you're sorry for fomenting dissent, that kind of thing, we'll let you out. And he didn't, so he spent the last 10 years of his life in jail. Similar to Paul. When Paul got arrested, he refused to do what he could have to get out of jail. Often sometimes associated with the Münster Rebellion of 1534-35 is when Anabaptist followers of Hoffman took over the city by force. They established a kind of communist economic and political system. However, Hoffman was in prison in Strasbourg at the time of the rebellion and during the time of the Free Münster State, or whatever they call it. The violence of the Münster Rebellion set back the cause of Anabaptists for many years. You'll recall that Anabaptist creed tends to be pacifist. They believe in strict separation of church and state. And here we have a bunch of Anabaptists that violently take over a city-state, which does not go along with normal Anabaptist views. Here's a wonderful wood carving showing the aftermath of the Münster Rebellion, and you can see all the Anabaptists being burned in the town square there. Just a little more about the Münster Rebellion, because there's not really any other place to put it in here in this course, so here we go. 1533, there came to Münster, a city of Westphalia, a certain number of Anabaptists who surpassed the rest of that fanatical tribe in the extravagance of their proceedings, the frenzy of their disordered brains, and the madness of their pretensions and projects. Now that means this person doesn't like this.
They're keeping it objective.
Perfect. Total objective. They gave themselves out for the messengers of heaven, invested with a divine commission to lay the foundations of a new government, a holy and spiritual empire to destroy and overturn all temporal world authority, all human and political institutions. Having turned all things into confusion and uproar at Münster by this seditious and extravagant declaration, they began to erect a new republic, conformable to their absurd and chimerical notions of religion, and committed to the administration of the John Bockhol, a tailor by profession and a native of Leiden. So they put a tailor in charge of running the city.
Tinker Tailor.
Which I think there's a certain flair to that, actually.
They dress well.
William F. Buckley one time said that he'd rather be governed by the first 100 people listed in the Manhattan phone book than to be governed by the elites. Their reign, however, was of short duration, for in 1535 the city was besieged and taken by the Bishop of Munster, assisted by other German princes. This fanatical king and his wrong-headed associates were put to death in a most terrible and ignominious manner, and a new hierarchy destroyed with his furious and extravagant founders. This outrageous conduct of a handful of Anabaptists drew upon the whole body heavy marks of displeasure from the greatest part of the European princes. The severest laws were enacted against them for the second time, in consequence of which the innocent and guilty were involved in the same terrible fate, and prodigious numbers were devoted to death in the most dreadful form. Probably during the Reformation, more Anabaptists died than all other Protestants together. And this totally unbiased account that we just read here is from an 1832 ecclesiastical history, and I thought it was so cool.
300 years after the fact, they're still
Yeah.
that angry about it.
Oh, then one other touch, because I knew inquiring minds would want to know. Bockelson, alias John of Leyden, who headed them at Munster, ran naked in the streets, married 11 wives, and at the same time he showed approbation of polygamy, and entitled himself King of Zion, all which formed but a very small part of the pernicious follies of this mock monarch. I think that shows some style too. You're the king of the city-state, you run naked through the streets, you marry 11 women. I mean,
Well, he must have been in good shape if he's running naked and marries 11 women.
Wow.
well, maybe that's how he advertised
Yeah.
to get the babes.
Goodness.
These are the baskets on the Tower of St. Lambert.
So attractive. Oh, yeah.
When the Catholics arrested the revolutionaries, they put some of the leaders in these cages on the side of the cathedral there. And they're still there today. Cool. This picture is worth, coming to for some reason. Which brings us to Zacharias.
So, why is he in the top 25?
Melchior Hoffman.
Yeah.
Because he's one of the founders of the Anabaptists, and because of, I wanted to remember at the beginning, and I'm sure you do because you hang them everywhere I say. At the beginning I talked about continuums, and there were people that were truly pacifist, and there were people who were violent, and the ones who were violent thought that violence was acceptable to accomplish your goals. The ones that were pacifists thought it was never acceptable. And I wanted to include Thomas Munster and Melchior Hoffman, both of them, to show that part of the continuum. It's not number 1 or number 2, it's number 24 for this.